Ecclesiastes in the other class is I'm going to continue with Ecclesiastes, that remarkable book by Solomon. Ecclesiastes, it seems to me, is a great antidote to the view that the Bible is a book of rules, and the purpose of reading the Bible is to dig out the rules and then follow the rules. And a lot of people who take that view want to dig out the rules and beat other people over the head with them. There's a lot of that going on. And Ecclesiastes is just not that way. Remember that it is, the Solomon is by far the likeliest author. There may have been some revisions or some other things that happened with the book at some point in its history. But it doesn't lend itself to being a book of rules. Like, if you're having an argument with another believer and you're quoting the Bible, just in general, Ecclesiastes is probably not going to be a good book to quote. Because essentially, Ecclesiastes records the wandering mind of a brilliant person who is on the edge of despair. Solomon is really kind of a negative Nelly. And it's surprising in a way. It's not if you have a wider, I think, view of human nature. But on the surface, it's surprising because Solomon has everything. Through no achievement of his own, he just lands in a place where God fulfills many of the promises that he made to Abraham centuries before during the life of Solomon. But he is also a person who personally achieves a lot. He enjoys every kind of pleasure, every kind of enjoyment. He is gifted and accomplished, and yet he is in deep despair. It reminds me sometimes of a friend of mine who was also gifted, good-looking, and charming and funny. When the two of us used to go out, it was so frustrating because the girls would just all crowd around him, and I'm standing there all by myself. And yet, one day, it was a successful career. He goes to a mental hospital and he checks himself in, and he stays there for months. And at one point, I told him, I said, maybe the best therapy would be to take you by helicopter and drop you in the jungle. And if you spent, several weeks with a tiger, on your backside, on your trail in the jungle, you might get over it. He said, maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. There is something about being on top. The professions that have the highest suicide rates are not like you would think it would be somebody in a bad job. That's not necessarily true. Doctors and lawyers, dentists have long had very high suicide rates. And I think it's because they are smart people, they have accomplished what they intended, and they still are not completely satisfied. And in fact, it's given them a perspective on life that allows them to look at kind of dark aspects to life. And so Solomon is in this position. Along the way in this chapter, I'd like to maybe make some comparisons with David, his father, and Christ, his descendant. And there's some interesting comparisons there. So beginning in chapter 4, verse 1. So I again considered all the oppression that continually occurs on earth. This is what I saw. The oppressed were in tears, but no one was comforting them. No one delivers them from the power of their oppressors. When we think of oppression, we tend to think of political oppression. We think of oppressive laws that occurred in the United States at one point. Or maybe on a much larger and more severe scale, we think of the totalitarian regimes of the mid-20th century, like the Nazis or the Soviets, or places like North Korea or Cuba today. China would be another example. And that's true. All of those are deeply, profoundly oppressive states. But you know, a great deal of oppression occurs not on a state or a political level, but on a personal level. Every crime, in a sense, is an oppressive act against the victim of that crime. Many people are abused by spouses. That can happen both ways. Or even within institutions. You think about, the Me Too movement. And I understand that's complicated. There's a lot of things going on there. But it highlights again that wherever there is a difference in power between individuals, there is the potential and often the reality of oppression. Solomon points this out. He says, well, it's not quite true. It's hyperbolic to say that it's everywhere. No one delivers them from the power of their oppressors, or no one comforts them. That's not always true, happily, but it is true very often. Verse 2. So he's thinking about that. Now, is anybody oppressing him? No, not at all. Not at all. If anything, he's probably on the other side of the oppressive spectrum. But anyway, he thinks about it. Verse 2, so I consider those who are dead and gone more fortunate than those who are still alive. But better than both is the one who has not been born, that has not seen the evil things that are done on earth. Solomon's meditations now take him to really the darkest place. He considers non-existence. Most of us have a horror of non-existence. Our mind reels at the idea of thinking about our own non-existence. Either non-existence in the sense of not ever having existed, because it's hard to do that because just thinking we exist, or the idea of non-existence at death, which in the Old Testament, again, there was not a lot of thought about an afterlife. It was very vague and needed to be, because apart from Christ, it was limited. The nature of death changed after Christ. Verse 4, and so he thinks about that, but then he reels back, he pulls back from thinking about death and non-existence as better. And he thinks about just craftsmanship and good work that people do. Let me read. Verse 4, then I considered all the skillful work that is done. Surely it is nothing more than competition between one person and another. This is also profitless, like chasing the wind. Chasing the wind is his phrase for futility. And so he thinks about maybe beautiful craftsmanship or skillful work. I remember having an awareness of this even as a small child. I remember watching my mother, maybe at 3 or so, watching my mother make a bed and thinking in my childish way that it was beautiful in a way. I remember seeing a bartender, maybe I'm giving away too much here. I remember another phase of my life, seeing a bartender flipping glasses and just moving across the counter. And I just remember thinking, that's really skilled, and there's something beautiful in the way that he does that. He disparages this in a way. He says, well, it's just competition. It's just people struggling against each other in a way. There's nothing to it. This is a fallacy that's sometimes called the reductionist fallacy. And it's something you can do about almost anything. And it can be distressing in a way, but it's really not true, even though it has a surface kind of veracity. So you can say words are just vibrations moving across air. Is that true? Yeah, it's true. Is there more to it than that? Absolutely there is. Human beings are just bags of water and cells. Well, yeah, but more than that. More than that. And the same thing is true here. Is there competition in work? Of course there is. Of course there is. One of the interesting things when you look at Solomon He has so much. And again, maybe it makes him think about larger things. But it also is a contrast with his father. If you read the Psalms, David is an emotional guy. There's no way around that. And I've even heard people say that he's manic depressive because, he seems to be just exulting and then in dark despair. But that's not true. His life was full of so many ups and downs. I mean, his brothers didn't like him, like he was the kind of outsider that the other brothers made fun of. He was the youngest, he's picked on. And then he's chosen to be king, and then he fights wild animals, and he kills Goliath, he becomes a national hero, and then he becomes a fugitive. And then at some point at that time, he's very successful. And then at Ziklag, there's a disaster, and his own men want to stone him. He's not manic depression. He's afflicted at times. He's struggling with those things. His mom really the same way. I mean, she's married to one guy. She's called into the palace. We don't know the circumstances of all of this. She has to make a new life against the backdrop of this humiliating beginning of a relationship. The toughness of their lives in some ways fortifies them against this kind of despair. I don't want bad things to happen to anyone, but sometimes struggles prevent people from falling into despair. It's just a fact. It's just a fact. And Solomon certainly seems like an example of that. So now he's disparaged work. Yeah, work is beautiful, but just people competing. But then he looks again, further, verse 5, the fool holds his hands and does no work, so he has nothing to eat but his own flesh. So if you fail to work, you're going to starve. Yeah. That's what's going to happen. And there are other dangers, of course. If you fail to work, you are likely to get into all kinds of trouble that you wouldn't get into otherwise. Yeah. Work is not just, this is a biblical view of work, is not just a means to an end. Work is how you contribute to the world. It gives purpose to your life. Living a life without purpose is tragic. We have so little time. It is going away. You're getting older. As your parents age, you see their bodies change. And it should be a reminder that your own time here is short, and we need to make the most of it. Why does the fool do no work? Well, maybe because he's thinking too much like Solomon, that it doesn't matter. Maybe they're afraid of challenges. In the book of Proverbs, it says that the lazy man says, I can't work because there's a lion outside. Well, I suppose, if there's a lion right outside of his door, he ought to be careful. But if there are lions outside in the wide world, you just got to work around it. And the same is true for us. Every kind of work has challenges. And if we shrink back from the challenges, I think we've missed something important. Verse 6, better is the one handful with some rest than 2 hands full of toil and chasing the wind. So our lives should be a cycle of work and rest. And that's physically true. The one feeds the other. We don't work effectively if we are unrested. I went through a time when I was averaging about 4 hours of sleep a night. And dangerously, I would fall asleep at stoplights. That's not good. And I couldn't sustain my focus. There were lots of issues there. So rest helps you work. But it's also true that work helps you rest. If you don't work out, if you're not physically active, you may have a difficult time sleeping at night. This is also true spiritually. We are called to certain activities and certain actions. There are certain things that we should all be doing, and we are all called to rest. More and more, I think of understanding the relationship of work and rest in our own lives as one of the central tasks of the Christian believer. So we're all called to something. We're all called to do something. Both individually and as believers as a whole. All believers are called to testify or to give or to do those things. And each of us are called to give or testify to particular people. But we may not know where we should be taking initiatives and where we should leave room for God's action. I think this is one of the main things that we should be praying about, that we should ask for insight. Is this something where I need to intervene, or is this something where I need to hold back? And by the way, I don't think the answer very often comes with a flash of light and angelic choir or anything like that. In the places where we see this, in the life of the prophets and in other places, I think it is that still small voice. I can remember when I was praying about my now soon to be over retirement, I just prayed and prayed for advice, for God to tell me what to do. And at some point, I stopped praying about what to do, and I prayed about how to do it. And in that case, you may have a different experience. You may have different experiences over the course of your life. But in that case, I just felt clarity. And I think, by the way, that it was an example of God's rest. Verse 7, so I again considered another futile thing on earth. What a negative Nelly. A man who is all alone with no companion. He has no children nor siblings. Yet there is no end to all his toil. And he is never satisfied with riches. He laments, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This is also a futile and burdensome task. I think of Scrooge in literature, who worked and made money, but he had no family and he was all alone. And I think Solomon doesn't consider another possibility, that the man who is alone works because it gives purpose to his life, and because it's a way, even if he can't serve family members, he can serve other people, even if he doesn't have children or other things. That's particularly rich in my case, because I am childless. So I bristle a little bit at what he says. In the New Testament, it is possible for us to look beyond life under the sun. Colossians 3:23 says, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters. So he's talking about the slave who has very little choice about the kind of work that he does. And yet, he says, do it. Now, there's two things. So do it as though working for the Lord. If you believe that God has put you in a situation, then embrace that situation and do the best that you can do. Take it as providential and make the most of it. Do it with all your heart. And I think it's possible to find meaning and even move on to other things when we do that. And then he looks at relationships. So he's talked about work, he's talked about the problems in life. Now in verse 9 he talks about relationships. Two people are better than one because they can reap more benefit from their labor. I can testify for that. I lived alone for a very long time. And I know that some people have bad relationships and bad marriages. I would say definitely married is better than single, and relationships are better than alone. And there are times when all of us are alone. There's no way around that, which is reality. But I've talked about this a little bit before. I just no longer believe there's such a thing as an individual, really. I mean, physically, we have physical bodies that are distinct and different from one another. But in terms of our experience of life, there are no individuals. We speak languages that shape our thoughts, and that we didn't invent. And our thoughts echo the thoughts of those around us. Even when we become believers, very few people become believers just because they've heard the gospel and embraced the gospel. Nearly everyone becomes a believer as part of a relationship. And it is true for us as well. The benefits, verse 10, for if they fall, one will help his companion up. but pity the person who falls down and has no one to help him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they can keep each other warm. But how can one person keep warm by himself? Tricky. Get a dog, I guess. Although an assailant may overpower one person, two can withstand him. Some better than others. Moreover, a three-stranded cord is not quickly broken. Boy, your choice of friendships, of social relationships are so important. We need to be careful. A poor but wise youth is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive advice. Well, the one has great potential, and the other is doomed, bound to fail. Verse 14, for he came out of prison to become a king. It sounds like Solomon has somebody specific in mind, even though he'd been poor in what would become his kingdom. Solomon now is just sort of lost in contemplating situations that are not his own. Verse 15, I considered all the living to walk on earth, as well as the successor who would arise in his place. There is no end to all the people, nor to the past generations. Yet future generations will not rejoice in him. This also is profitless, like a chasing the wind. I taught long enough so that popular cultural references that I could make at some point in a class just stopped making sense to young people because they just didn't know who those people were. People that were hugely famous at one point in time, no one knows who they are. And there are places in the world where there are huge numbers of manuscripts recording all kinds of knowledge and information important to the people who wrote it down that no one can read. Think about a whole language, sayings, ideas, music, all of those things, none of which are accessible to any people today. All lost. This is true. Sometimes I will drive by Houston or some other place, and I'll think, what will this look like as a ruin? I think the ancient ruins have turned out very well sometimes. They're beautiful as ruins. I am not sure that will be true of the ruins of Houston. By the way, we hope that's not soon. We hope that's not right away. But it will be. At some point, it will be a ruin. Be careful what you do when you go to the temple of God. So now he's turned from work to achievement, friendships. He's finding problems with all of them. Now he's going to talk about religion. So that's going to work, right? Well, maybe not. Be careful what you do when you go to the temple of God. Draw near to listen rather than to offer a sacrifice like fools, for they do not realize they are doing wrong. You often hear the idea that religion is part of man's search for God. But I think a really good argument could be made that religion is part of man's evasion of God. It's a way of keeping ourselves busy, to sort of convince ourselves that we're aligned with God, but we're not doing anything really that God wants us to do or said that we should do. We're doing the stuff that we want to do that keeps away that nagging idea that we need to be responsive to God. It's a substitute often for actual godliness. The most righteous thing in that religious system was to perform a sacrifice. And yet he says they're doing wrong. Christ says the same thing. If you don't do the sacrifice with the right heart, you're actually doing wrong. If you have other issues between you and God, even between you and people, you're doing wrong. And so religion turns out to be a problem as well. At this time particularly, this was true. They had a very, term they use sometimes is formalistic approach to religion, which is that you had to perform the exact right ritual at the exact right time, in the prescribed manner. And if you failed to do that, or if you sneezed in the middle of it, or something like that, that was a disaster. But that's not what God's talking about. That's not his focus. Christ addresses the same thing in Matthew 6:7. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Meaning is more important. Meaning is more important. thoughtful prayers. I understand all of our prayers fall into repetition at some point. But we also ought to reevaluate them. We also ought to be, well, let me read on. Do not be rash with your mouth or hasty in your heart to bring up a matter before God. For God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore let your words be few. Well, one thing for sure that he's talking about is don't, sort of give God this elaborate plan. I want you to do this, and then this, and then this, and this, and this, and then this. If he's going to answer your prayer, he's got a way that he's going to do it. I try to make a point. Yes, I have prayers, and yes, they can be repetitive at times, but I try to make a point of saying different things, and also of being quiet. I rarely have the experience of being quiet and then, suddenly feeling certainty or confidence about something, that God has given me direction. That doesn't happen very often. But I do think that silence is an invitation to God to speak. And what I usually find, and the example that I always think of is my retirement when I was praying about that. I prayed about it and prayed about it and prayed about whether I should until I realized I was praying about how I should go about it. I had just found conviction where I had had no conviction before. Just as dreams come when there are many cares, so the rash vow of a fool occurs where there are many words. Here's another problem with vows. So if God hasn't asked you to do it, why are you doing that? Like, what is it? Are you trying to... so it's a little bit like, and some of you may have run into people like this, people who do favors, but really they're trying to put you in their debt so they can manipulate you into doing something else. There are a lot of people like that. This is I don't know, have any of you seen The Godfather? Anybody seen The Godfather? That's the opening scene of The Godfather. He says, at some point, I'll do you this favor, but at some point, I'm going to require a favor of you. That's not a good way to approach God. That I'm going to do you this favor unasked, in that case, and then you owe me. It's not a good way. Here's the other problem with a vow. We're specifically warned really not to do it. You've essentially created another area where you could disobey. Because if you make the vow and then fail to follow through, it's a disaster. Well, I won't say it's a disaster, but it's not good. And there was a time in an earlier part of my life where I made vows and then felt like the right thing to do would be to renounce the vow. And so now I just don't do it. I just don't do it. It seems to me in many ways a mistake. So a vow is sort of a rule that you're going to be this or do that, and maybe, that is in line with becoming a better person. But God has already given you things to do. Focus on those things rather than the things that you come up with. In effect, what you're doing is you're adding another rule or another law. The Old Testament is made up of 613, traditionally, 613 rules or laws. Well, adding to whatever it is God has required of you just gives you another opportunity to break that law, to break that rule. And so, not helpful. Not helpful. Instead, we should be focusing on the things that God has given us to do without distracting ourselves with our own vows. It is better for you not to vow, he says, than to vow and not pay it. And kind of along the same line, do not let your mouth cause you to sin. Do not tell the priest it was a mistake. Why make God angry at you so that he would destroy the work of your hand? Yeah, just don't. Just in general, don't do it. I've done it and regret it. Don't do it. Just as there is futility in many dreams, dreams don't really produce anything, so also in many words. Therefore, fear God. Just think about what you say is the bottom And then he thinks about like our larger institutions. Verse 8, 5:8. If you see the extortion of the poor or the perversion of justice and fairness in the government, do not be astonished by the matter. For the high official is watched by a higher official, and there are higher ones over them. The produce of the land is seized by all men, by all of them. Even the king is served by the fields. Of course, what's ironic about that? Solomon is the beneficiary of this system. He's talking about this is a corrupt system with the king at the top. And yeah, and that's me. And that's me. So I give him some credit, because most people at the top of a system like that couldn't really follow that all the way through without making excuses. But Solomon arrives and he gets it. Maybe he just thinks it's too hard. We want to be idealistic about government, but there are many reasons not to be. But there are also reasons to make it as good as it can be. It is a gift of God, but one with many hazards. Verse 10, the one who loves money will never be satisfied with money. He who loves wealth will never be satisfied with his income. This is also futile. This is true of anything. In fact, the things that we love inordinately are the things that will harm us the most. So any addiction is that way. Any kind of addiction, anything, any pleasure that we love will be the pleasure that will destroy us. I was thinking, I was listening to the 50s on 5 on Sirius the other day, and cars were really just starting to be cool in the 50s. And there's so many songs about cars and car crashes. And it's true that my risk with cars is less because I just don't care about them. Like, I can't imagine myself racing because I just don't care. I just don't care. There are many hazards in this life that I am, if not preserved from, shielded from because of indifference. You can't live your life indifferent to everything. And so the people you love, they will be the ones that cause you pain. People that you're indifferent to usually won't cause you pain most of the time. That's true. And it's true of everything else. The things that we love cost us. And especially anything that we make a God that isn't. Verse 11, when someone's prosperity increases, those who consume it also increased. So what does its owner gain, except that he gets to see it with his eyes? The bottom line is that every gain has a cost. Embedded in every solution is a problem. The Proverbs say that a man's wealth can pay a ransom, but the poor man hears no threat. So it cuts both ways. The sleep of the laborer is pleasant, whether he eats little or much, but the wealth of the rich will not allow him to sleep. A lot of life is about expectations, and when our expectations are inordinate, we have problems. We could go on, but this is probably as good a place to stop as any. Some of us are going to go downstairs. Just a quick reminder that we will be meeting in a new location next time. Any questions? Comments? Lord God, we thank you for all of the good things that you make available. Give us wisdom and direction. Help us to see our own life with a wider perspective. In Jesus' name.